In December 2008, the final Tecumseh engine rolled off the assembly line in New Holstein, Wisconsin, silently ending a 50-year reign over American driveways and winter storms. The factory simply went dark. Just a decade earlier, this engine was an unavoidable piece of American hardware. Their legendary Snow King line held a near monopoly over winter, powering tens of millions of snowblowers from Toro to Sears Craftsman. The sudden shutdown sent a shockwave through a vast mechanical ecosystem. Local small engine repair shops, the businesses that kept American neighborhoods running, were left staring at empty parts bins. Homeowners suddenly realized their stubborn iron workhorses were now orphans. The paradox is that the engines themselves had not failed. A Tecumseh flathead could still start on the third pull in sub-zero weather. But the American market no longer rewarded heavy, loud, repairable durability if it could not pass strict emissions rules or compete with cheap overseas clones. But the real story of Tecumseh is not only about a bankrupt factory, it is the story of how the American suburb was built on a cheap, loud, repairable sound, and what happened when that sound became a liability. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in New Holstein, Wisconsin, in 1956. In 1956, the American landscape was changing faster than at any point in its history. Millions of families were leaving crowded cities for the newly built suburbs, trading apartment stoops for driveways, backyards, and front lawns. This massive migration created an unprecedented mechanical problem. A suburban lawn was not a farm, but it still required labor. Grass had to be cut. Driveways had to be cleared of snow. The manual push mower and the steel snow shovel were no longer enough for the sweeping subdivisions of the post-war boom. America needed power, but it needed it scaled down, cheap and ready to store in a one-car garage. At that exact moment, the Tecumseh Products Company was looking for a new way to grow. Based in Michigan, Tecumseh was not an engine builder. They were an industrial giant in the refrigeration business, stamping and casting millions of compressors for air conditioners and refrigerators. But Ray Herrick, the company's founder, understood manufacturing. He knew that the core of a refrigeration compressor and the core of an internal combustion engine, an engine that burns fuel inside its cylinders to create power, required the exact same industrial foundation. Both needed cast metal, machine tolerances, valves, and a factory that could build them by the millions without losing money. Herrick saw the American suburb expanding, and he saw that a single company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was quietly taking over the new market for yard power. Briggs & Stratton. Tecumseh had the foundries, the money, and the mass production discipline to challenge them. What they lacked was a proven engine design. They found their answer in New Holstein, Wisconsin. In 1956, Tecumseh purchased the Lawson Manufacturing Company. Lawson was a highly respected builder of small engines, with roots stretching back to the 1890s. They had built durable farm engines and early outboard motors, but by the mid-1950s, they lacked the immense capital required to fight a national war for the American lawn. When Tecumseh bought Lawson, they did not just buy a factory. They bought a ready-made engineering department, a workforce that understood combustion, and an immediate entry into the market. Tecumseh did not stop there. A year later, in 1957, they acquired Power Products in Grafton, Wisconsin, a company famous for its lightweight two-stroke engines. An engine that completes a power cycle in 2 piston strokes, often making high power for its size but with emissions and oiling trade-offs. With Lawson providing 4-stroke engine reliability, an engine that completes intake, compression, power, and exhaust strokes across 4 piston movements, and Power Products offering 2-stroke speed. Tecumseh now owned the complete spectrum of light industrial power. These acquisitions were the first major strikes in what would become a 50-year war for the American garage. Almost immediately, Tecumseh realized that the old way of building a small engine, a compact power unit used in lawnmowers, snowblowers, generators, and pumps, was too expensive for the modern consumer. Historically, farm and utility engines were built with a cast iron block, the main engine structure that holds the cylinders and major internal parts. Cast iron was incredibly strong and held heat well, but it was heavy, slow to machine, and expensive to ship. If a homeowner was going to buy a lawnmower at a local hardware store and push it across a quarter-acre lot every Saturday morning, the engine could not weigh 40 pounds on its own. It had to be light, and more importantly, it had to be cheap. Tecumseh accelerated a massive industrial shift toward aluminum. By injecting molten aluminum into precise molds, the new Holstein factory could produce engine blocks at a staggering speed. Aluminum was lighter, dissipated heat faster, and cut the weight of a standard mower engine in half. More importantly, it slashed the manufacturing cost. This was not just an engineering victory, it was a retail breakthrough. In the late 1950s, engines reached Americans through systems. A company could build a great machine, but if it did not fit into the existing distribution network of hardware stores, catalog sales, and farm supply centers, it would fail. Tecumseh needed scale, and they found it in the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog. By securing massive fleet orders from companies that built yard equipment for Sears, specifically the Craftsman line, Tecumseh guaranteed that their engines would be shipped to nearly every zip code in the country. A homeowner flipping through a catalog in 1959 did not have to understand the thermal properties of an aluminum block, nor did they care about the displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders. They just saw a rotary lawnmower that cost less than a week's wages, ready to be picked up at the local Sears Auto Center. The engine had become a household appliance, but unlike a refrigerator that sat silently in a kitchen, a small engine demanded a ritual. It required the smell of spilled gasoline on a driveway, the checking of the oil pump, and the physical pull of a starter cord. The new Holstein factory was suddenly producing the mechanical heartbeat of the American weekend. Tecumseh had the factories, the aluminum casting technology, and the distribution network. They had established a foothold against Briggs & Stratton, turning the small engine market into a two-horse race that would define American yard work for generations. The factory was ready, but to conquer the American yard, Tecumseh needed more than just a running engine. They needed a machine that could survive the absolute neglect of the American homeowner. By the early 1960s, Tecumseh faced a mechanical problem that could not be solved by mass production alone. A lawnmower engine could not operate like a stationary generator or a heavy tractor. It had to be pushed up steep suburban embankments, tilted over curbs, and shoved under low-hanging branches. Early small engines often relied on gravity-fed fuel systems, meaning if the mower tilted too far, the fuel stopped flowing, and the engine simply died. To conquer the uneven American yard, Tecumseh aggressively adopted and perfected the use of the diaphragm carburetor. A carburetor is a device that mixes fuel and air before the mixture enters the engine. But instead of relying purely on a float bowl and gravity, a diaphragm carburetor used a flexible rubber membrane that pulsed with the engine's vacuum, actively pumping fuel into the combustion chamber regardless of the engine's operating angle. This was not just a technical upgrade. In a practical American scene, it meant a homeowner in Pennsylvania could push a spinning lawnmower sideways across a 30-degree ditch without the engine sputtering out. Homeowners were no longer restricted to flat, perfectly manicured lawns. They could clear brush on steep, uneven terrain and maintain properties that previously required expensive professional landscaping equipment. The machine bent to the will of the landscape. Combined with a lightweight aluminum block, Tecumseh engines were now cheap to cast, easy to ship, and incredibly versatile. Inside the new Holstein plant, the machining lines moved at a relentless pace. Thousands of aluminum blocks were cast, bored, and assembled daily. The scale of production drove the manufacturing cost down to a point where the engine was no longer a luxury item. It was a basic household utility. But Briggs & Stratton had already saturated the summer grass market. To build an empire that could not be dismantled, Tecumseh had to claim a territory where their rival was vulnerable. They found it in the dead of winter. In 1962, Tecumseh launched a line of engines that would become the undisputed mechanical authority of the American snowbelt, the Snow King. Building an engine to cut grass on a warm July morning was fundamentally different from building an engine to clear heavy, wet snow in January. Winter is violently hostile to internal combustion. Sub-zero temperatures thicken oil into sludge, shrink metal tolerances, and freeze condensation inside fuel lines. A snowblower engine had to start when the homeowner was standing in a dark, freezing garage at 5 in the morning, wearing heavy gloves, pulling a frozen recoil cord before leaving for work. The Snow King succeeded because Tecumseh leaned heavily into the flathead design. A flathead is an engine design where the valves sit in the block rather than in the cylinder head. By modern engineering standards, the flathead was wildly inefficient. The airflow pathway was convoluted, it ran hot, and it burned fuel poorly. But efficiency was not the metric of success in a February blizzard. Reliability was. The flathead design meant there were no delicate overhead push rods to bend or snap when a cold, oil-starved engine was violently forced into high RPMs. It was a blunt, heavy-breathing iron and aluminum brute that could tolerate the absolute worst maintenance habits of the American homeowner. Tecumseh engineers modified the Snow King specifically for the cold. They added metal heater boxes around the carburetor to prevent icing. They redesigned the recoil starter with oversized handles so a user wearing thick winter mittens could firmly grip the pull cord. They added aggressive rubber priming bulbs that allowed a frustrated homeowner to physically force raw gasoline directly into the intake tract for a cold start. When the engine fired, it barked to life with a harsh, unrefined clatter that echoed off snowbanks. A loud metallic rhythm that became the defining acoustic signature of a Midwestern winter. By the late 1960s, the Snow King was not just a successful engine family, it was a monopoly. Tecumseh secured massive fleet contracts with the most trusted hardware names in America. If a homeowner went to a Sears retail store and bought a Craftsman snowblower, they were buying a Tecumseh block. If they bought an Arian snow machine to clear a long Wisconsin driveway, it was powered by a Snow King. Toro, another titan of yard equipment, relied heavily on Tecumseh to power their winter machines. This distribution network was the true breakthrough. Tecumseh did not have to sell engines directly to the public. They sold them to Sears, Toro, and Arians, who then put them in every garage from Maine to the Dakotas. The engine was priced as a commodity. A homeowner did not need a bank loan to buy a 5-horsepower Snow King, horsepower being a measurement of how quickly an engine can do work. They simply bought the machine from a catalog, filled it with cheap gasoline, and expected it to run. But Tecumseh knew that even a cast-iron cylinder sleeve and a forged crankshaft, the rotating shaft that turns piston motion into rotational power, could not survive forever without service. The final pillar of their breakthrough was the establishment of a massive, decentralized service network. Tecumseh flooded the country with heavily detailed, oil-resistant service manuals and cheap replacement parts. They did not require specialized, high-end dealerships for repairs. Instead, they empowered the local small engine repair shop. In almost every American town, there was a cinder block garage filled with the smell of stale fuel and solvent, run by a mechanic who could rebuild a Tecumseh carburetor with his eyes closed. The parts network meant that an engine did not die when a gasket failed or a jet clogged. It was simply placed on a workbench, taken apart with basic hand tools, and put back into service before the next snowfall. A homeowner could walk into a local hardware store, buy a $3 carburetor rebuild kit or a replacement spark plug, and fix the machine themselves on a Saturday afternoon. The local parts counter became the lifeline of the American yard. Tecumseh had created an engine that was cheap enough to mass produce, rugged enough to survive winter, and simple enough for a teenager to rebuild. They had woven their machines into the fabric of suburban life, securing contracts that guaranteed millions of units sold every year. They had built the engine that could survive the cold, but they had not yet realized that they were building the mechanical identity of the American working class. By the 1970s, the Tecumseh Products Engine Division was no longer just a challenger to Briggs & Stratton. It was an industrial empire running at maximum velocity. The new Holstein plant in Wisconsin had become a sprawling mechanical fortress of foundries, machining lines, and assembly bays. The air inside the factory smelled of hot aluminum, cutting fluid, and industrial exhaust. Thousands of workers stood at assembly lines, dropping forged crankshafts into aluminum blocks, torquing bolts, and bolting on the distinctive metal shrouds that would soon sit in millions of American garages. Tecumseh had captured the American winter with the Snow King, securing contracts with Toro, Arians, and Sears Craftsman. But an engine manufacturer could not survive on winter alone. The company needed to own the summer, and they needed to own the rapidly expanding market of suburban recreation. During the late 1960s and 1970s, the American backyard transformed. It was no longer just a place to cut grass. It was a place for go-karts, mini-bikes, and utility vehicles. Tecumseh seized this cultural shift by mass-producing engines that were perfectly suited for cheap recreational speed. The 5-horsepower Tecumseh Flathead became the undisputed mechanical heart of the American mini-bike craze. Companies like Rupp, Fox, and Alexander Reynolds built thousands of small, raw steel frames, but the machine was useless without a power source. The Tecumseh block was cheap, accessible, and easily modified. A teenager with a basic socket set could remove the governor, a mechanical device designed to limit the engine's maximum speed for safety, and suddenly a piece of lawn equipment became a neighborhood race car. This was not just a manufacturing victory, it was the moment Tecumseh trained an entire generation of Americans on how to turn a wrench, diagnose a flooded carburetor, and understand the relationship between fuel, spark, and speed. The reach of the Tecumseh empire in this era was staggering. Through massive fleet orders and catalog distribution, the engine was inescapable. If a homeowner walked into a Montgomery Ward, a J.C. Penney, or a local hardware store to buy a rotary mower, a tiller, a portable generator, or a trash pump, there was a massive statistical probability that the machine was powered by a Tecumseh block. They were turning out millions of engines a year, dominating the private label market. Sears did not cast its own engine blocks. They contracted Tecumseh to paint them black, slap a Craftsman decal on the starter shroud, and ship them across the country. The engine had become a utility as common as a light switch, but one that required physical interaction. In an America where a Saturday morning was measured by the smell of cut grass, and a winter storm was fought with iron and a pull cord, power was not a silent battery. It was gasoline, noise, and an engine that you could fix on a garage workbench. Power was a system, and Tecumseh had perfected the system. By the 1980s, the service network was arguably more valuable than the engines themselves. The local small engine repair shop was a vital institution in the American suburb. These cinder block shops, often located behind hardware stores or tucked away in industrial parks, were filled with thousands of small cardboard boxes printed with the Tecumseh Indian head logo. Because the flathead design was fundamentally simple, a mechanic did not need a computer or a specialized diagnostic tool to keep a Tecumseh running. They needed a feeler gauge to set the ignition points, a wrench to clean the carburetor bowl, and a strong arm to test the pull cord. The engines were loud, they vibrated heavily, and they burned fuel with aggressive inefficiency, but they were deeply, inherently fixable. This repairability was the foundation of the brand's trust. A homeowner did not throw away a Sears Craftsman snowblower when the engine stopped running. They dragged it to the local shop, paid $30 for a carburetor rebuild and a new spark plug, and kept using the machine for another 10 years. The engine was an investment in iron, supported by a parts catalog that seemed infinite. By the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the Tecumseh engine division had reached a level of scale that made them a structural pillar of American yard work. They were no longer just supplying Sears and Toro. The American retail landscape was shifting toward massive big-box hardware stores, and the companies supplying those stores, massive metal stamping corporations like MTD and Murray, needed millions of engines to bolt onto their lawnmowers, tillers, and snowblowers. Tecumseh was ready to supply them. The factory lines in Wisconsin were operating at a staggering volume. The Snow King line in particular had evolved. It was no longer just the basic 3 or 5 horsepower block. As American driveways grew larger and consumers demanded wider, heavier 2-stage snowblowers, machines that used an auger to break the snow and a separate high-speed impeller to throw it, Tecumseh scaled up the displacement. They introduced massive, heavy-breathing flathead engines producing 8, 10, and eventually up to 13 horsepower. These larger blocks were cast-iron sleeve brutes. They vibrated so violently that they often shook their own muffler bolts loose, but they generated immense torque, twisting force, often felt as the pulling strength of an engine. When a 10-horsepower Snow King hit a wall of frozen, compacted plow wash at the end of a driveway, it did not stall. The governor simply snapped the throttle wide open, the exhaust barked a deep mechanical roar, and the machine chewed through the ice. This mechanical reliability created a cultural phenomenon. In the aftermath of the massive Midwestern blizzards of the 1980s and 1990s, an entire neighborhood could be mapped by sound. The harsh, unrefined clatter of Tecumseh flatheads echoed down every street. It was the sound of American homeowners reclaiming their driveways, relying on a machine they had bought out of a catalog 10 years earlier, and maintained themselves with a socket set. The sheer volume of these engines in circulation created an economy of scale that seemed untouchable. The Tecumseh dealer network and independent service shops were supported by an ocean of replacement parts. At local hardware stores, pegboards were lined with blister-pack carburetor rebuild kits, float needles, spark plugs, and replacement primer bulbs. Because the engines changed so little from year to year, a mechanic did not have to stock hundreds of different, highly specific components. A handful of universal carburetors and gaskets could service a decade's worth of production. This was the peak of the American pull-cord monopoly. The company had built a system where the machine was cheap enough for the average suburban homeowner to buy, yet durable enough to be repaired indefinitely by the local shop. It was a perfect equilibrium of manufacturing scale, fleet trust, and mechanical simplicity. The engine division was generating massive revenue for the parent company, and the name Tecumseh was stamped into the metal of millions of machines sitting in sheds, garages, and barns across the continent. They had conquered the cold. They had conquered the American yard. They had built an industrial system that seemed completely immune to failure, supported by an army of mechanics and a public that accepted noise and vibration as the necessary cost of raw power. The era of the American pull-cord monopoly seemed permanent, but the first threat to the empire would not come from a competitor's factory. It would come from a rule book. The first crack in the empire was almost invisible to the American homeowner. It did not happen at a parts counter, and it did not happen on a factory floor in Wisconsin. It happened in a regulatory office in California in 1990. For decades, the Tecumseh engine division had relied on the blunt reliability of the flathead engine. But the flathead design contained a fatal flaw that had nothing to do with durability. Because the valves were located in the engine block alongside the piston, the combustion chamber was wide, irregular, and highly inefficient. The engine ran rich, meaning it constantly pulled in more fuel than it could completely burn. Every time a homeowner pulled the recoil cord on a Saturday morning, the exhaust expelled a heavy cloud of unburned hydrocarbons. That smell of raw, unburned gasoline was the nostalgic scent of American yard work. But to environmental regulators, it was a massive, decentralized pollution crisis. In 1990, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, announced that it would begin regulating emissions from small off-road engines. 5 years later, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, adopted Phase 1 emission standards for small utility engines across the entire country. This was the collision of Force 3, regulation, emissions, fuel economy, and certification, with a manufacturing system that had been optimized for cheap, dirty power. Regulation does not make a story simple. It creates a new engineering problem. For Tecumseh, the problem was existential. The rules dictated that a small engine could no longer simply run. It had to run cleanly. To meet the new standards, the small engine industry had to abandon the flathead and move to the overhead valve design, or OHV. An overhead valve engine, a design where the valves sit in the cylinder, head directly above the combustion chamber, usually operated by push rods, allows fuel and air to flow more directly, burning cleaner, cooler, and with far greater efficiency. The Japanese manufacturer Honda had been quietly perfecting small OHV engines throughout the 1980s. When the new emissions rules took effect, Honda was already waiting. Their GX series engines were a revelation. If a landscaper or a homeowner started a Honda OHV engine next to a Tecumseh flathead, the difference was jarring. The Honda was quiet. It did not shake the handles of the lawnmower. It did not smell like raw fuel. And most importantly, it easily passed the new emission standards. Tecumseh suddenly found themselves trapped by their own scale. This was the brutal reality of Force 1. Iron, aluminum, fuel, and manufacturing costs. The new Holstein plant was a sprawling, highly optimized machine built to cast, machine, and assemble flathead engine blocks by the millions at a rock-bottom price. To transition the entire product line to OHV meant completely retooling the foundries. It required new casting molds, new machining lines, new assembly procedures, and new training for a workforce that had spent 30 years building the exact same flathead architecture. It was a staggering financial burden. Tecumseh attempted to adapt, introducing their own OHV lines like the Enduro series. But engineering an OHV engine on a strict budget was difficult, and early Tecumseh OHV models struggled to match the smooth, bulletproof reputation that Honda was establishing in the premium market. The market began to fracture. Commercial landscapers, fleet managers, and premium equipment brands started migrating toward Honda or paying a premium for upgraded Briggs & Stratton OHV engines. A landscaping crew running a commercial walk-behind mower for 8 hours a day could not afford the vibration, the fuel consumption, or the noise of the old flathead. They gladly paid more for a quiet, fuel-efficient machine. Tecumseh's grip on the premium summer market began to slip, but they still had winter. The Snow King line remained a massive revenue generator because, in a February blizzard, homeowners did not care about engine noise or smooth idling. They cared that the machine started. Toro, Ariens, and Sears craftsmen continued to buy millions of Snow King engines, providing a financial safety net for the engine division. But even the winter monopoly was no longer safe. The EPA Phase 2 emissions standards were looming, tightening the noose on the flathead design even further. Every year it cost Tecumseh more money in research, development, and carburetor modifications just to keep their legacy engines legally compliant. The profit margin on a 30-year-old engine architecture was shrinking rapidly. The machine was still running. The service network was still intact. A homeowner could still walk into a local repair shop and buy a carburetor rebuild kit for $3. But the underlying economics of the American pull-cord monopoly had fundamentally changed. The brand had survived the first wave of regulation, but they had spent massive amounts of capital doing it. The factory was burdened, the parent company was growing restless, and the next rival was already waiting, not with a better engine, but with a cheaper one. While regulation forced the engine to change, the final blow would come from an entirely different direction, bringing a flood of foreign iron that would make the very concept of American repair obsolete. While regulation forced the engine to change, the final blow would come from an entirely different direction, bringing a flood of foreign iron that would make the very concept of American repair obsolete. By the early 2000s, the small engine market was experiencing a massive structural shift. The traditional American hardware store and the beloved Sears catalog were being rapidly replaced by massive, big-box home improvement retailers. Companies like Home Depot and Lowe's demanded absolute cost control from equipment manufacturers like MTD, Murray, and Husqvarna. Every component on a lawnmower or a snowblower was scrutinized for cost, and the engine was the most expensive line item. At this exact moment, overseas manufacturers began producing millions of inexpensive overhead valve engines. These were the clones, unlicensed or heavily derivative overseas copies of established engine architectures, most often based on the highly successful Honda OHV design. Because these engines were manufactured in massive, state-of-the-art facilities in China, without the legacy costs of older American plants, they could be sold to equipment makers for a fraction of the price of a Tecumseh. This was the brutal reality of Force 1, iron, aluminum, fuel, and manufacturing costs. An American factory in New Holstein, paying Midwestern wages and operating aging foundries, built for flathead engines, simply could not build a compliant, clean-running OHV engine cheaper than an overseas factory could build a clone. The math no longer worked. If a big box retailer demanded that a new snowblower retail for under $400, the equipment manufacturer had no loyalty to the Tecumseh Indian head logo. They bought the cheaper engine. The massive fleet orders that had sustained the Wisconsin plant for decades began to evaporate. Even Sears craftsmen, the long-standing fortress of the Snow King, began looking at alternative power plants to keep their entry-level models competitively priced. The pressure began to tear the company apart from the inside. The parent organization, Tecumseh Products Company, was still primarily a global titan of refrigeration compressors. For decades, the engine division had been a highly profitable counterpart, but by the mid-2000s, it had become a financial anchor. It was bleeding cash, struggling with warranty claims on transitional engine designs, and failing to regain the market share it had lost to Honda and the clones. Corporate patience finally ran out. In 2007, the parent company made the decision to amputate. They sold the entire engine manufacturing division to Platinum Equity, a private equity firm. The operation was rebranded as Tecumseh Power, stripped of its connection to the refrigeration giant, and expected to survive on its own in a market that was actively rejecting its core products. It was a classic example of Force 6, corporate consolidation, acquisition, and brand survival. The badge remained on the starter shrouds, but the industrial backing that had given the engine its strength was gone. The company was now operating on borrowed time. When the global financial crisis struck in 2008, consumer spending on yard equipment plummeted. The American homeowners stopped buying new snowblowers and lawnmowers, choosing instead to stretch the life of their old machines. For a highly leveraged private equity acquisition, a sudden drop in sales volume was fatal. The numbers simply could not be justified. In December 2008, with almost no warning to the public, the plug was pulled. The new Holstein plant was shut down. The assembly line stopped moving. The molten aluminum cooled in the foundries. A company that had spent 50 years building the mechanical heartbeat of the American suburb simply ceased production. The collapse sent an immediate, paralyzing shockwave through Force 2. Dealers, fleets, farmers, pilots, and service networks. Tecumseh had not just built engines, they had built an entire ecosystem of repair. Across the snowbelt, thousands of local small engine mechanics woke up to find that their primary supplier no longer existed. Imagine a cinder block repair shop in Michigan in January 2009. A customer drags in an 8-horsepower Snow King that will not start. The mechanic diagnoses a cracked carburetor bowl and a blown head gasket. They go to their parts catalog, call their regional distributor, and are met with a terrifying reality. The parts are on indefinite backorder. There is no factory to cast the aluminum. There is no warehouse to ship the gasket. The vast, decentralized repair network that had made Tecumseh legendary was suddenly starving. Mechanics had to scavenge junkyards and strip dead engines just to keep customer machines running. The American habit of repairing a broken yard machine was suddenly disrupted by the sheer impossibility of finding factory-supported iron. The engine still ran. The big box stores demanded lower prices. The foreign clones arrived. The emissions rules tightened. The parent company walked away. The private equity firm pulled the plug. The parts network collapsed. The factory lines went dark. The sound faded. The badge remained. The world it powered was gone. The machines were left without a maker. But in barns, sheds, and garages across the snowbelt, the engines refused to die. The death of the new Holstein factory in 2008 was supposed to be the absolute end. But an engine empire built on tens of millions of cast iron and aluminum blocks does not vanish just because a private equity firm files for bankruptcy. The machines were too deeply embedded in the American landscape to simply disappear. In 2009, something highly unusual happened in the aftermath of the collapse. Certified Parts Corporation, or CPC, a company based in Janesville, Wisconsin, stepped into the wreckage. They did not buy the company to build new engines, and they could not restart the massive foundries. Instead, they bought the intellectual property, the engineering blueprints, and the remaining tooling specifically to keep the existing machines on life support. CPC knew that across the American snowbelt, there was still a massive, desperate demand for carburetors, gaskets, and recoil starters. The brand survived, but it survived entirely as a parts supplier for a ghost fleet. Today, original Tecumseh parts are prized commodities. Mechanics became scavengers, hunting through old dealership inventories and relying on aftermarket copies just to keep the remaining machines running. The name Tecumseh no longer exists on new hardware store shelves, having been entirely replaced by foreign clones and modern overhead valve engines. But it thrives in an entirely different American ecosystem. If you walk into a vintage engine show, a Midwestern swap meet, or scroll through rural estate sale listings, you will find the flatheads. There is a massive subculture of mini bike and go-kart restorers who actively hunt for original 5-horsepower Tecumseh blocks. For these builders, a modern Honda clone is too quiet, too smooth, and entirely devoid of character. They want the harsh, raw, unrefined mechanical clatter that defined American childhoods in the 1970s. They trade rusted engine shrouds bearing the old Indian head logo, debate carburetor jetting, and painstakingly rebuild blocks that were originally designed to be nothing more than cheap, disposable utilities. And across the Rust Belt, the winter monopoly still holds out in isolated pockets. Stubborn homeowners still drag 30-year-old Sears, Craftsman, and Arian snowblowers out of their garages every winter. They prime the stiff rubber bulbs, choke the carburetors, and rely on the exact same cast iron cylinder sleeve that cleared the massive blizzards of the 1980s and 1990s. This is not nostalgia. It is not just a generation of older Americans missing a loud sound on a Saturday morning. A surviving Tecumseh engine sitting on a garage workbench is a physical argument about how the country used to understand machinery. We have entered the era of electrification, the massive shift from fuel-burning mechanical power toward electric motors, sealed lithium-ion batteries, and software-controlled systems. Today, if a battery-powered snowblower or lawnmower fails, the homeowner does not take a wrench to a carburetor bowl. They check a warranty code, wait for a replacement, or throw the plastic unit away. The user is entirely locked out of the machine. An old Tecumseh flathead represents the exact opposite. It proves that American yard work used to involve a physical-mechanical relationship. The homeowner had agency over the equipment. If the engine broke, you walked to the local parts counter, bought a $3 float needle, learned how to set a spark plug gap, and fixed it yourself. The noise, the heavy vibration, and the smell of spilled gasoline were the acceptable, tangible costs of mechanical independence. It was a time when repair belonged to the people, not to the manufacturer. That independence is no longer mass-produced. If you travel to New Holstein, Wisconsin, today, the physical footprint of the massive factory complex still exists, but the foundries are silent. The town that was once defined by the relentless rhythm of aluminum casting, machining lines, and factory labor had to find a new identity after the engine division collapsed. The parent company, Tecumseh Products, eventually relocated its refrigeration compressor business, survived through various corporate reorganizations, and left the small engine legacy behind entirely as a closed chapter of industrial history. The name survives now as a historical warning. It is a testament to what happens when an industrial empire optimizes perfectly for cheap, reliable power, but fails to anticipate the brutal, combined forces of environmental regulation and foreign manufacturing scale. America did not stop needing to clear its driveways or cut its grass. It simply stopped needing that kind of power. The market decided that quiet, clean, and disposable was more valuable than loud, dirty, and infinitely repairable. The old service network collapsed. The cinder block repair shops closed their doors. The mechanical heartbeat of the American suburb was permanently silenced by the rulebook and the battery. Yet the old iron refuses to vanish completely. Somewhere in a Midwestern garage pushed behind a wall of modern, silent plastic tools, an old Toro snowblower still sits in the cold. The red paint on the Tecumseh engine shroud is faded, the steel gas cap is scratched, and the primer bulb is cracked from age. But the pull cord is still stiff, the block is still solid, and it is waiting for a February morning that no longer sounds the same. See you in the next one.